The stop of the HMS Bounty at the Cape of Good Hope in April 1788 was a critical moment in the ship's long journey, a brief but significant interlude that offered a glimpse of civilization amid the hardships of a lengthy voyage. Though the ship's mission was far from over, this stop would not only serve as a necessary resupply point but would also act as a moment for the crew to briefly escape the monotony of life at sea and the oppressive atmosphere aboard the ship. The journey to the Cape. The Bounty set sail from England in December 1787, tasked with a mission of paramount importance, to collect breadfruit plants from the island of Tahiti and transport them to the British Caribbean, where they were to be planted in the colonies to feed the enslaved labor force on sugar plantations. The ship's crew, commanded by Lieutenant William Bligh, was about to embark on a grueling journey that would take them around the world, navigating treacherous waters and facing unknown challenges. By the time they neared the Cape of Good Hope, the crew had already endured several months of hardship. The journey had taken them along the western coast of Africa, past the perilous waters of the Atlantic Ocean, and into the unpredictable southern hemisphere. The long voyage had tested the limits of their endurance and patience. The Cape, however, represented both a necessary break and a point of no return. The Cape of Good Hope, located at the southern tip of Africa, had long been a critical maritime waypoint, a place where ships could resupply with provisions like fresh water, meat, and fruits before continuing their long journeys across the seas. It was a port where vessels could replenish their stores, make repairs, and find refuge before navigating further into the Indian Ocean, around the Cape Horn, or toward distant lands. The city of Cape Town, located in Table Bay, was a bustling hub under Dutch East India Company control, offering the sailors a chance to refresh their spirits after many months at sea. Arrival at the Cape of Good Hope. On April 5, 1788, the Bounty arrived in Table Bay, just outside Cape Town, after rounding the Cape Peninsula. As the ship anchored, the sailors breathed a collective sigh of relief. The vast and rugged African coast was now behind them, and they could finally step ashore after months of confinement aboard the ship. Bligh, ever the strict leader, remained on board the ship with his officers, overseeing the logistical operations of refueling and resupplying. Despite the opportunity for a brief respite, Bligh's authoritarian approach continued to exert its pressure on the men, and his rigid control over the ship was only adding to the growing unrest among the crew. However, for many sailors, the sight of land, and the promise of a few days of freedom, provided a sense of much-needed release. The men were eager to stretch their legs and sample the comforts of the port. For the first time in months, they could step off the ship and interact with the local population. Cape Town, a colony under Dutch East India Company rule, was a lively port city populated by both Dutch Boers, farmers, and British settlers. The Dutch had long controlled the Cape, but the British had made overtures to strengthen their presence in the region. The city was filled with a mix of European settlers, merchants, soldiers, and indigenous Khoikhoi and slaves. The crew's interaction with the local community. The crew's interactions with the residents of Cape Town were varied. Some of the sailors took to the bustling streets of the city, eager to explore, buy fresh food, and trade with the locals. The port was filled with ships from all corners of the world, Europe, the East Indies, and beyond, and it was a melting pot of cultures and goods. The atmosphere was one of commerce and activity, and the men relished the opportunity to experience it firsthand. Some sailors even found temporary solace in the town's taverns, enjoying a brief escape from the rigid discipline of life aboard the ship. The interaction with the local women, particularly the Dutch and indigenous Khoikhoi women, was not uncommon, as many sailors formed fleeting romantic entanglements during their short stay. These brief encounters added to the sense of freedom and liberation the crew felt during this stopover. For Bligh, however, the visit was purely functional. While his men enjoyed their respite, he remained focused on the mission and on maintaining strict discipline. The reality of the tensions aboard the Bounty was only exacerbated by this visit. While the men reveled in the taste of freedom, Bligh's iron grip on them remained unyielding. The sailors, particularly Fletcher Christian, the ship's master's mate, grew increasingly frustrated with Bligh's lack of understanding of their needs and their desires for a life beyond the harsh constraints of naval life. The growing resentment. The Cape stop was a brief, yet significant moment in the story of the Bounty. It was a place where the sailors' frustrations with Bligh's leadership began to crystallize. Bligh's strictness had already earned him the resentment of the crew, but it was in Cape Town where the disparity between the freedoms they tasted in the port and the oppressive conditions aboard the ship became starkly clear. For many of the sailors, the carefree atmosphere of Cape Town, with its relative freedom and pleasures, only highlighted the severe limitations of life at sea and the strict rule of their captain. The sailors were exposed to the possibility of a different, more relaxed life, and the stark contrast between life in Cape Town and life aboard the Bounty only deepened their yearning for freedom. This visit to the Cape also had broader implications. The presence of the Dutch East India Company officials in Cape Town served as a reminder of the larger powers that loomed over the men's lives. The sight of Dutch and British officers, their authority apparent in the port's orderly operations, emphasized the sailors' perceived insignificance in the grand scheme of European colonialism. The longing for freedom, for a life of autonomy and choice, became more palpable as the sailors interacted with the locals and absorbed the atmosphere of the colony. Departure and the path toward mutiny. After a few days in Cape Town, during which the ship was resupplied and minor repairs were completed, the Bounty set sail once more, leaving the familiar shores of the Cape behind. However, for the men aboard, the sense of freedom they had experienced on land would remain fresh in their minds. The voyage continued toward Tahiti, but the tensions among the crew were growing. The Bounty's journey had taken on an almost unbearable weight, especially as the men prepared for the long stretch across the Pacific. The restlessness, amplified by the brief taste of liberty at the Cape, would soon reach its breaking point. The stop at the Cape of Good Hope, with its promise of respite, had proven to be a double-edged sword. The crew's desire for freedom had been rekindled, and the authoritarian rule of Bligh had only further alienated them. It was not long after leaving the Cape that the seeds of mutiny fully sprouted. The Bounty would reach Tahiti, and the crew's discontent would escalate, culminating in the famous mutiny led by Fletcher Christian in April 1791. Bligh, along with his loyalists, was cast adrift in a small boat, and the ship was taken by the mutineers, who would eventually settle on the isolated Pitcairn Island. Thus, the visit to the Cape of Good Hope, though brief, marked a key turning point. It was a time when the sailors' frustrations became undeniable, a moment of reflection on the harshness of their lives at sea, and a reminder of the freedoms they could not access while under Bligh's oppressive command. It was, in essence, the calm before the storm, the last peaceful moment before the mutiny that would change the course of history. As the Bounty set sail again from the Cape of Good Hope, the fresh supplies and brief respite from the harshness of life at sea could not quell the simmering discontent that had been building among the crew. The sailors, having tasted a brief taste of freedom and a sense of relief from the authoritarian rule of Lieutenant Bligh, found themselves growing increasingly resentful as they returned to the rigid confines of their ship. The Cape of Good Hope had been a brief oasis, but the return to their duties aboard the Bounty exposed the cracks in the ship's command structure and the dissatisfaction of its crew. The tension continued to rise as the ship ventured further into the Indian Ocean, bound for Tahiti. The journey to the Pacific was long, and the sailors' frustrations grew as they faced the monotony of life at sea. The promise of a tropical paradise in Tahiti did little to assuage their growing desire for autonomy and freedom from Bligh's oppressive leadership. Bligh, focused entirely on his mission and unwavering in his approach, continued to exert control over the crew. His harsh discipline and rigid rules were met with growing resistance. While Bligh's leadership style had once been respected, it was now seen as an obstacle to the men's well-being. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the divide between Bligh and his men deepened. Among the discontented crew members was Fletcher Christian, the ship's master's mate. Christian had long been a close confidant of Bligh, but the tension between them had been escalating ever since the Cape. Christian, a man who had once respected Bligh's leadership, began to see the captain's inflexibility as a threat to his own future. The experience at the Cape had been a catalyst for Christian's growing resentment, and he began to question whether the mission was worth the toll it was taking on the men. The growing unrest culminated in the fateful events of April 28, 1789, when Fletcher Christian and a group of conspirators staged a mutiny against Bligh. Christian, who had once been loyal to the captain, now took command of the ship. Bligh and his loyalists were cast adrift in a small boat, left to survive on their own in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The mutiny would forever change the course of history, but it was in the days leading up to the event that the seeds of rebellion were sown. The brief respite at the Cape of Good Hope, with its brief promise of freedom, had made the crew's dissatisfaction with their lives aboard the Bounty all the more stark. The mutiny, when it came, was the inevitable result of a crew pushed to the brink by the rigid leadership of Bligh, the oppressive conditions at sea, and the glimpse of freedom they had tasted in Cape Town. After the mutiny, the Bounty's fate took a dark turn. The mutineers, seeking refuge from the British Navy, would eventually settle on the remote Pitcairn Island. As for Bligh, despite the hardships he endured after being cast adrift, he survived and eventually returned to England, where he continued to serve in the British Navy, albeit with a tarnished reputation. The journey of the Bounty, with its brief stop at the Cape of Good Hope, had set the stage for one of the most infamous mutinies in maritime history. The Cape, a place where the crew had briefly escaped the constraints of life at sea, had ultimately highlighted the tensions and divisions that would lead to the downfall of Bligh's command and the rise of the mutineers. Though the stop at the Cape of Good Hope had offered a brief respite, it also marked the beginning of the end for the Bounty's ill-fated mission. It was a turning point in the saga of the ship, a moment when the crew's frustration and desire for freedom reached a boiling point, setting the stage for the dramatic events that would follow. The Cape would remain, in the annals of history, as the site where the mutiny that altered the course of the Bounty's journey began to take shape. Following the mutiny aboard the HMS Bounty, the ship's fate was sealed. With Fletcher Christian at the helm, the mutineers set sail to avoid the inevitable British retribution. Bligh and his loyalists, cast adrift in a small boat, were left to navigate the unforgiving seas with little more than their will to survive. Despite the odds, Bligh and his men managed to reach the island of Timor after a remarkable 47 days at sea, where they were able to secure passage back to England. Meanwhile, the mutineers, desperate to avoid capture by the British Navy, made their way to the isolated Pitcairn Island, a speck of land in the Pacific Ocean, far from the reach of any major empire. It was here that they would eventually settle, carving out a life in one of the most remote places on Earth. The mutineers, including Christian, sought to create a new society, free from the constraints of British naval discipline and the oppressive rule they had endured under Bligh. However, their utopian vision quickly turned to tragedy as infighting, conflict, and the consequences of their past actions took their toll. The legacy of the Bounty and its infamous mutiny would endure long after the events of 1789. The story of the mutiny has been immortalized in countless books, films, and retellings, capturing the public imagination with its themes of rebellion, tyranny, and the search for freedom. The Bounty's journey was marked by a series of contradictions: the tension between order and chaos, the allure of freedom and the cost of rebellion, and the harsh realities of life at sea. The stop at the Cape of Good Hope, although brief, had played a pivotal role in the narrative of the mutiny. It was there that the crew had briefly tasted a life of ease and liberty, which only highlighted the oppressive atmosphere aboard the ship and the harshness of Bligh's leadership. That moment of freedom would remain etched in their memories and fuel the discontent that ultimately led to the Bounty's downfall. In the years following the mutiny, the surviving mutineers on Pitcairn Island faced their own challenges. Over time, their numbers dwindled due to conflict, disease, and isolation. The descendants of the mutineers would eventually become the island's inhabitants, a group with a unique and complex history. As for Bligh, despite the hardships he faced, he returned to England, where he was hailed as a hero for his survival and leadership in the aftermath of the mutiny. However, his reputation as a tyrant remained, and his role in the events aboard the Bounty would forever be debated. He went on to have a long career in the British Navy, but his legacy was forever marred by the events of 1789. The mutiny aboard the HMS Bounty remains one of the most famous incidents in maritime history. The brief stop at the Cape of Good Hope, with its fleeting moment of freedom, was a catalyst for the rebellion that would change the course of the ship's journey and the lives of everyone involved. It was a moment that symbolized the tension between duty and desire, between order and chaos, and ultimately, the human yearning for freedom, no matter the cost.